Greetings, adventurous travelers and fellow keepers of the lake. How are you all doing? Welcome to the third episode of the podcast.
Lakeforge.
It is a forge beneath the lake of creative thinking that sips the water from it and creates interesting ideas and questions that we and other artists then dream about and ask questions about. And a less known fact is that if you stand near this mystical lake for too long, you start seeing things that are not there, figments of your mind or figments of reality. So, this is the topic we want to cover today. We want to talk about hallucinations in TTRPGs and other forms of art, and why hallucinations in particular, because I might have made a promise online that I will do a trilogy explaining and going through and breaking down concepts of changed or altered perception of reality that we call visions, dreams, and hallucinations. And I did a video about visions, I'm very proud of it, that breaks down visions into these narrative elements. And I did that for dreams as well. And for some reason, it didn't feel right at the time to create a video about hallucinations. And I think this is one of those topics that are much better given justice if you have someone to talk to about them. So I'm here with my friend Lazar. So what do you think about this choice of topic for today?
To be honest, at first I thought that there's not a lot of things to say about hallucinations. I mean, they're just hallucinations, we all
It's
think-
just hallucinations,
yeah, I mean, we maybe experience some in the game, but like, why would you use it? Why would you talk about that for maybe like an hour? Didn't really make sense, but then I came back to your definition that you would like to give again of the hallucinations and making a distinction between dreams and visions. And then it all, started to form a full picture for me and say like, oh, okay, there's some questions that I would like to ask. There's some things that I would like to add, and it's worth of a try. So let's see.
Yes, the definition of visions, dreams, and hallucinations. This is something I really thought about a lot because I saw some scenes in movies and in other games, especially Call of Cthulhu. That's where I first saw what I now call a vision. Basically, we had a situation where one of the players went into this underground tunnel that some lizard people made underneath some rich guy's house in Call of Cthulhu. So we're talking 1920s. And they were exploring this underground layer. They figured out it's ancient. It's much older than the dinosaurs and whatever. And they saw these inscriptions on the walls. They started decoding them. And as they did, they all made a power roll, which is like a will save in D&D. And those who failed had a vision that was described in the book, but I forgot what it was. So I just improvised, and I remember I said something like, you see the whole room becoming red. You're transported in a land where everywhere around you are stone snakes. The stone from the snakes is cracking and falling down. You see the glistening gold scales as the snakes move to you and start to swallow you alive. You're now in your crib as a child, looking at the stars and seeing two faces kiss. And as they do, stars start falling down. They hit the ground around you, but not full-size stars, little speckles. And as they do, trees start to rise next to you. And I mean, I'm making up this on the fly. I don't remember what the true vision was, but there's the idea. You see that all the time. Indiana Jones picks a ancient totem thing from the pedestal, and like eyes roll back into the head, and you have this short, almost like a cutscene that shows you some interesting things that are not tied to your body or to time or space. Everything is in this fluid form. And if you have an outer body experience that lasts in in-game time and the time it takes for you to describe it, about 5 minutes, and you don't have agency as the player inside those 5 minutes, I would call that a vision. Then you might say, well, if you describe it like that, it also can be a dream, right? Well, dreams are longer. That's the first distinction. So I would say visions up to 5 minutes. Dreams have no limit in their length. You can have full sessions that are inside the dream if all the players are having like this shared dream or whatever. And the other big distinction is that in dreams, you have agency. You're constantly making some choices that this dream reality reacts to. They don't have to be reactions that are possible in real life. That's the whole point. The dream is something that doesn't follow the laws of the world that were established up until now, but it still has some reaction to you. So then we ask the question, where do hallucinations fall on this scale? And I would say that hallucinations, given these definitions, are more like dreams in a way, because they can last however long you want them to be, and you have agency. So, how do you define hallucinations then? Well, I would say that they are dreams that are overlapping with our reality, almost like a glimpse into another reality. They modify what you're seeing, and this is an important thing. Imagine that, when you're working with like photos and you have like these Instagram filters or whatever, and you have the opacity slider. Well, when your opacity is at 1, only the first layer is visible. But as you move opacity to 0, it becomes transparent. Yes, transparent. And you see the layers underneath as well. So I would say that there is a slider where when you go towards 0, you transition from a dream to a hallucination. Good example of this would be as a character in a game. Imagine you're walking down the street and suddenly you think everyone turned their head, even maybe unnaturally, just turned their head and they're always facing you. You're still in the quote unquote real game world, but you're seeing something that might not be true. If you push the slider towards the dream more, you're not going to be in the same street in the real world anymore. You're going to be traversing a maze of streets, maybe even those dissolve at one point. But if you go like less than this, everything less than this example, I would say, is pretty much a hallucination. There is no question about it. So there is a point where you ask, well, is this even reality? That is not the question that we want people to ask with a good hallucination. You're not asking, is this reality? You're asking, is my reality slightly changed or wrong? If this makes sense.
I would even ask, is my reality reality? Because that's what I think hallucinations really do.
But in that way, if you're asking if your reality is reality, wouldn't that be a dream?
No, in some moments when you ask yourselves, is this what's happening? What I see is happening. Yeah, okay, it actually might not be a thing that's happening, but it's happening in your head. That's how you see it. In that case, reality actually is making our perception problematic. And if hallucinations gives us some new clues, something interesting, some new truth, which they usually do, are they more realistic in some way than our reality? Because in reality we couldn't see those things. So I'm saying, sometimes maybe hallucinations can add to the truth, let's say it that way, and they also make real life more real. If we talked about simulation, if I have something to contrast it with and say, okay, this is how my this is how disorder of my perception looks like. So the world is real, I just don't see it very realistically. So if you have something very unrealistic on on the other side, you perceive the other element, the so-called reality, more realistic, more trustworthy. I don't know.
You see, that is a good point. And when we look at horror games, and I have to go and touch upon horror because all these distortions of reality are fine in fantasy games, but there is a question in fantasy games with hallucinations in particular. Is this a hallucination or is it an illusion? And an illusion is a hallucination that is induced by magic or another optical mean. So it's not inside your head. Well, it is if it's magic, but it's still someone is like using a magical way to alter it. I
So
don't know.
let's say
For me,
let's say illusion would be externally induced hallucination.
yes, it would be externally induced.
But I have a feeling like hallucinations are always kind of externally induced.
They are, but they can have a certain delay. That's what makes them interesting. So when you eat something in the magical forest, in Feywild, you can start to feel the effects, and it's usually fun when you know, oh, it must be what I ate or something like that. But for illusion magic is so bountiful in fantasy that you cannot really call it a hallucination. I think even if they represent the same thing, one is inherently magical. So it's, yes, you're questioning reality, but you're not questioning, how would I put it? You're not questioning if your reality is being changed because of your own mind being changed. You're saying, yeah, probably an illusion because it's so common in fantasy world. And I would say that now that I think about it, maybe that question, am I broken, is what is interesting when we talk about illusion in horror. So you said that it can make you question if your reality is even real. And I think in Cult, Divinity Lost, very controversial game, but I think there is a lot of interesting ideas there. There, the lore of the game is very gnostic, so people are kind of living in a simulation, kind of living in the matrix, and hallucinations are those outer rings of reality bleeding into the real world. So yes, there I can completely see how that would be like showing you the real reality.
I just think that hallucinations are always happening in your head, and no matter what's the source, what's the trigger of hallucination, what's the context, it's still hallucination. And I'm fine with just defining it as a perception that has some kind of
Alterations.
alterations. I was trying to avoid a word disorder, but because sometimes it's a good thing if it brings positive changes to the world. I would really ignore the context, the source of hallucination, the reason of hallucination, because it would really bring a lot of terms that pretty much explain the same idea. You're having alternation of perception, and that might have a different results. You can act while you have those images in front of you. I would still keep it as a definition of hallucination and wouldn't go, but definitely what you said, it makes a lot of new questions. For example, like how can hallucinations be used in fantasy worlds? Because if what we see, we as players don't perceive as reality, then what's happening in that already alternated fantasy reality is definitely something else, right? Like it has to break another walls and another boundaries to be considered as hallucination, and that should definitely be a subject for its own.
Yes, and I think an illusion is guided and purposeful misdirection of your senses by an external source. I think that
But
pretty
wait,
much.
what if I don't know that there is a source?
No, no, no.
You know,
We are now talking from two different perspectives. Maybe you're looking at it as a player, and I'm looking at it from a GM standpoint. So for me, I know if I'm using an illusion spell or I'm giving you a trippy hallucinations because of reasons.
but if the player in that particular moment when he's acting, regarding the things that he sees in front of him, his alternated perception, then it doesn't matter for him. Like if he can act, for him, that's hallucination.
For sure. Yeah, I don't have anything against that. I'm just obsessed with giving unneeded definitions to things. But I think it is tied to the setting and the genre as well, because there is no illusion in Call of Cthulhu. I would say that illusion there would be maybe an optical illusion if you really like see something that is like, you know, those optical illusions that are like sciencey things. But everything else would pretty much be a hallucination if it's just overlaid on top of your reality. And yeah, while we are on the topic of Call of Cthulhu, there, for example, you as the DM have the tool called delusion. I'm not a big fan of the word. Honestly, I would just say hallucination or something like that, where you can alter anything in your description when the player's sanity is low enough and they have some mechanical ways to like disbelieve it. But that's like when the player makes a choice, I don't trust you, DM. I think that is a hallucinations. They can roll, and if they fail a roll, they become even more crazy. But in that way, it's very loosely used. It's like you can do anything as the DM to alter the perception. You can have a description said to one player and then description of the same thing said in a different way to another player, and it's mechanically governed in a way. I want today to be more general in a way. Look at the story impact. Ask the question: why are we even using this tool? And can we maybe classify some things that are spicy for the story?
Well, there's one idea that really changed the perception of hallucinations and dream in any art form, and that would be, psychotherapy, that says that all those things are actually just the reflection of our unconscious, and they're really useful in that way. If interpreted right, you can maybe get some truths about your inner self that you didn't know about. But if you think that way, using just this idea, it really pose another important question. So if the GM is the one who's giving hallucinations, he's ordering them, he's like modifying them.
He's the mushroom.
Yeah, he's the mushroom. No, seriously, if that happens and he's giving the visions, right, they should reflect your unconscious. I mean, that doesn't really make sense. You should be the one who gives the parts of your unconscious being.
That is a good way. Also, another interesting thing that we can say about illusions and hallucinations, but I will leave the illusion topic for another time. As you said, I'm getting attached to it. So, yes, we can make a distinction between those hallucinations that are based around your internal state, because a lot of times we're not aware why we're getting certain imagery. Like in dreams, for example, we don't know why we're dreaming some things. So that's the part of the freedom of GM to fill. And that's why I think you can still use hallucinations and say, oh, maybe that's something in your character's subconscious, because you have your own subconscious that you're not conscious of, and then your character is like a conscious representation of someone else that you've thought of. So now you have their own unconscious to manage. And I think the DM can easily slide into that and say, in one instant, you see that the light is green, but it was red. Like some almost like I would call those instant hallucinations, those that are just like you saw something in a blink of an eye. So those are not maybe coming from your subconscious. Those are something that the DM can use if you're in a certain situation to do like storytelling and pacing stuff.
Okay, I mean, I can definitely agree that GM has those rights. I mean, he has all the rights, unfortunately. But I mean, we promised. I know this that we could, talk about this like philosophically for a long period of time. But I think we kind of own, to the people to say something practical. And I would really like to, start with that questions like, why do we use hallucinations? Like, what could be functions of this technique? Can you give me some good examples of yours, or like, why do you use them? Because you are, pretty well known for using dreams, visions, and hallucinations. I would say you are my most psychedelic gym ever. this would
Well,
this would be cut in post processing.
yeah, definitely. So we can split this also. I like classifications. Oh my God. But let's say that one of these is to convey information. So sometimes hallucinations can be useful to you. Sometimes you would go away from the path of the main story. Let's say in Call of Cthulhu, you have been seeing this symbol in this cave, and you've hit a dead end, maybe a puzzle that you're not really aware is a puzzle, and the DM sees their oversight that it wasn't obvious enough. So you start going into different places in the world, and at one point something happens, you feel dizzy, and you start seeing the symbol on people's foreheads. Again, we are playing a lot of horror games, so that's where these examples come from. But in that moment, you see that I don't think the world, but you are in a way connected to the place you were exploring earlier. Might give you an incentive to go back or look for that symbol in a library or like ask around.
We could say that one function of hallucinations would be definitely to bring some new meaning, right? Like it can be
Definitely.
symbolic meaning, the one that requires more analysis or something very obvious. But generally, it adds to the meaning. You can that's the moment when I talked about it like already before, like that's the valuable moment of hallucinations from my perspective of view, because if they add something more to the reality than perception of reality itself, they are kind of more realistic in a way. I mean, we know they're not, but if we could be the one to choose when to switch it to hallucination and turn it back off, like that would be a very useful thing, useful skill. I can see an item that can do such things and like make a very informative hallucination for me, and then I can just go back to reality.
That's very interesting. Let's imagine now we are tapping into an interesting example here, but I like to give players tools that alter reality. We have this worm that is altering time. I sound like a broken record mentioning it everywhere, but I think it's very, very interesting, very new, something I haven't seen done before. So that's why I try to get it out to people as much as I can. But imagine giving the player the ability to tune in into like almost a parallel world that is very similar to ours, but almost like a radio. They can tune into the hallucination and back and like perceive things from two different realities. I think a lot of computer games do this. There is a ton of games that give you that extra vision. Even Witcher has the Witcher vision. You have every FPS ever have the infrared look through walls vision. Like the alteration of vision basically is in a way a hallucination. Giving that power to the players would be quite interesting.
I'm really feeling bad for rarely seeing those things as a my power, usually as a disorder. But I can see the function, and really. In just that domain, it really has a lot of power. You can use hallucination to motivate some elements in the story that are coming from another world, another universe, something transcendental, something that you wouldn't expect, and then if it happened in reality, that would probably affect your sanity a lot. So given as hallucination, that thing can still be informative. You can kind of get familiar with it, and it just since you feel that's just hallucination, it doesn't affect your mental state the way that those elements would really come to your world and interact with you directly.
Yes, and when you say it will affect your sanity, I want to say that one big answer to the question why you would use hallucinations is horror. Let's say uh, the example I said with the symbol that is on people's foreheads. Imagine you're playing Call of Cthulhu, and that symbol is not just glowing on people's foreheads; it has been like carved into them, and you can see like it's faintly glowing, and you're trying to have a conversation with someone, but your eyes look at it and they are like, do I have something on my forehead? They start questioning it. And like you see how the reality doesn't see what you see. And that is a tool for horror, I would say. Even if you're an occult type of character, you would still be like, okay, there's something is really wrong with my reality. And of course, there are a ton of horror movies that all those jump scares where you see something that isn't there for a brief second, they're all hallucinations in a way that induce horror. They don't have any other use but to induce horror in that way. So I think for now we have convey information and we have horror. We can also say that by having a dark hallucination, for example, at the beginning of a game, you're in a way setting the tone of the session. You're setting the tone of the game. You're saying to the players, we're gonna have a scary night tonight. So setting the tone is another good use for this, I think.
I would call that function different name, and setting a tone could be that name, because they are there in that case to balance the atmosphere, the way that players see the world around themselves. So if it's very scary, you can use a hallucination that can be very optimistic, and nice hallucination, something you would like to keep hallucinating in a horror setting. And then on the other hand can be complete opposite. You don't see any danger coming soon, you can really use some hallucination to anticipate bad things going to happen. I think that hallucination can be a very nice tool for balancing atmosphere, the way the players feel about the world. And that can be individual thing, or you can do it as a group thing. It depends. And that's the moment when we come to a different question. What happens when hallucinations are not considering only one player? It's a like group hallucination. Then it really adds to the value, that it's you have a feeling that something big and important is happening, because all of you see something that's unlikely there. So I would say it has a lot of different functions that I would just call the setting a theme, you said, or yeah,
Setting the tone.
setting a tone. Yeah, definitely that describes it well for me. And we come to one more question. What about NPCs? What happens when NPCs are having hallucination that are sharing with another players?
Definitely. I think I had an example of something similar in my dreams video where I asked the question about the shared dreams and what happens if you're sharing a dream with an NPC. Do they act like the next day? Do they act like nothing happened? Do they believe the dream? Do they seek you out? I think with hallucinations, one thing that is different than with dreams is that to have a shared hallucination, most of the time you need to share the same location. For example, you're sitting in the tavern and you start seeing blue butterflies manifest in the world, in the tavern around you, and you see just the barkeep looks around, tries to keep their cool, and you like see them looking at the butterflies. Even like one butterfly lands on their face, and that you see them doing that with their hand. Maybe another NPC walks by and says, "What are you doing? Why are you hitting yourself?" And you see that this NPC is experiencing the same thing as you. Now you ask the question as the player, should I go talk to them? Absolutely, I should go talk to them. It's not even a question. You're going to go and do it. And what is fun there is you are asking the question, why is this NPC connected to me? Because you're experiencing something that maybe other players are not. And you see this NPC that is outside the party experiencing the same thing. Why? You don't, as a GM, need to know the answer right away, but it will for sure just laser focus your party's attention onto this NPC.
Oh, I definitely agree. Like I can see how can player bond so then unexpectedly quickly with that NPC. My question is like, how can you use those functions that we already mentioned when it comes to NPCs hallucination? For example, like let's say NPCs claims to see or hear things that other don't. but their vision have some, clues. It have some information player doesn't.
So not a shared hallucination, but just the NPCs hallucinating and reporting on that to the player.
Exactly. Like let's say he said like, the old hermit stares into the flames and mutters, the red moon is here, don't look into its eyes or you'll never wake.
Yeah, that
Would
can
you
work.
believe to him? Like, would you? I mean, for me, important moment is like if players just reconsider what he says, like if they're putting it into consideration and thinking about it, no matter what their action would be at the end, what would they decide to do, if it makes them think, is this really weird stuff that I didn't expect, to hear? If that guy sees things that way, maybe we are not seeing things the right way, even though we see it perfectly clear and he's obviously not
Would you
seeing it clearly.
would you really question if that's like more the realer reality, or would you just say, crazy old hermit man? I think you know how you get people to give a damn about that. You just continue. The hermit adds, it's right behind you. And then
I can see that happening.
and then you start asking, well, even if it's 1% true, what is behind me?
If we come back to our function, that this brings more information, some informations unavailable to players who are not hallucinating, uh, then it, like, used through NPC, it really brings the, that same value, but like boosted, on steroids, I would say. So using it through NPC, hallucination has, in my opinion, like even bigger effect, because when you are making player hallucinate, you are somehow, I would still say, like, you are limited, like you cannot maybe say that he sees things that they just don't fit his character in any way, like they can be opposite to what he's as a character thinks, right? Those hallucinations, they can be like complete opposite, but still they show some unconscious characteristics of his that he is not really aware of. In this case, I don't think, like, if you are doing hallucinations to players, even though it's still a big disorder of their perception, that it is really unlimited. It must have some limitation to what you already know about him.
I don't necessarily agree, honestly, but I think that's more of a style thing. For me, I would feel like I can do unlimited things to a player as long as I have a good enough uh, reason why this hallucination is happening in the first place.
But that's the thing, you need a reason. For NPC, you don't need a reason, you just need an idea.
Well, you don't need a reason for neither right away. You can always make some hints about it through the sessions and then have a reveal what it was 2 sessions, sessions down the line, maybe in the same session. So that's, in my opinion, I really think it's more of a limitation on how much you can distort reality and not in what way. I mean, there can be distasteful ways, but then we also brush next to the topic of taste, and it really boils down to what the GM likes. And when we're on the topic of taste, we should probably make a disclaimer that, as with all interesting concepts in storytelling, you should not overdo it. Of course, you have exceptions, like a campaign that is only tied to hallucinations, for example, for some reason. But you don't want to overdo it. It's not something that you would be using all the time in all the sessions. It's something that you use in a short campaign, let's say a 10 shot, about 3 to 4 times maximum. If you're playing a game that is like with sanity loss and those the mental death spiral. If you don't have that and you're just using it in your D&D campaign, for example, if we're not talking about illusions, I would say pure hallucinations are one-off. I wouldn't do it all the time. Once it can happen to a player, maybe it can happen to an NPC. If it's a thing that starts to happen, like maybe the whole town is for some reason eating something that has gone bad and they have these visions and whatever. If you have a reason for it happening more often, cool. But
I have one question. Like, if they're happening too often, let's say that's happening in reality to one person and he's hallucinating very oftenly, I don't think like that would definitely make a mess inside of his head. So let's say a character is experiencing frequent hallucinations. I think that should
seek a doctor.
yes, seek a doctor
or a priest.
or maybe you just feel good about them and say like, okay, these hallucinations help me see some things that I wouldn't other way, and they definitely affect my sanity. I'm becoming crazy. That's the thing that he's gonna think about. But like, if I'm crazy, maybe this like crazy world, because we always kind of play in a crazy world usually, or we are trying to, or we at least think that our world is crazy. And even the real one, I would argue that it is a little bit crazy and getting crazy. I think like it's
this
losing
timeline
sanity
is
for sure.
this timeline with AI and everything happening in the world, it's an interesting one.
But I'm saying, if you are losing sanity and you're having hallucinations more and more often, and then you are having pretty good experience with dealing with hallucinations and like taking that extra information from them, extracting it from your hallucinations, that you would say, okay, maybe like lucidity is not a bad thing. I can maybe be a lunatic of a kind, and see things differently. That can add to the story and to the group, honestly. Like, if you approach it that way, I can see like, why would we always have one extreme lunatic in a group? He sees things different way. It can become very problematic in some situations that require pragmatic thinking and everything like that. But in some other situations, it can be really insightful.
Yes, in that case, I wouldn't be the one describing the hallucinations. I would give that ability to the player if they're playing a completely like wacky character that has their own way of seeing the world. That's their job to manage then. And then we would apply what we talked about in our metafiction and emergent world building episode, the first one, and say that it's a collaborative thing for the GM to interpret. So now we are changing who is doing what. It's not the GM describing and the player interpreting. Now the player is describing their experience of reality, and the GM is trying to fit reality into that in a way. Maybe take some interesting motive from that hallucination and use it somewhere else in the world. And the second thing is, there is always a disclaimer that people have to keep in their heads when they're making characters like this, to remember that it is a team game, and when you have someone that is too insane and uncooperative, then you get frustration from the other players. I'm sure that people that are listening to this podcast know that already, because this is quite deep in the rabbit hole, I would say, but still worth mentioning. And yeah, in Call of Cthulhu, there is an optional rule called Insane Insight. And it's basically when you lose enough sanity to be indefinitely insane, you have those illusions. Yes, those delusions, as they're called in the book, that give the DM the ability to alter your perception at will. And the optional rule says that you can roll to see if your current insanity gives you some information about your current threat or your situation. And sometimes you can have a aha moment. And it is also encouraged. I'm not sure in which book exactly. Is it in Pulp Cthulhu? Maybe it is encouraged for the player to think of insanely illogical way they connected their insanity to that information that you give them, just as a narrative little thing to spice up the game. So yeah, that's absolutely something that that works. And I see that we are, like, when I talked about dreams and visions, I didn't touch upon sanity as a mechanic that much. For those who don't know what sanity is in Call of Cthulhu, basically you have a number. Every time you see something disturbing, you roll. If you fail that roll, that number decreases, and when it reaches a certain threshold, you roll the dice to see what debuff you get. That's the simplest way to say it. Those debuffs are usually
mental.
yes, and they hinder your play. So
they're just the flavor.
they're very flavorful. When multiple players lose sanity and start going freaking out and role playing that in
That's
the middle of
already a
combat,
soup.
yeah, that's insane. Stories come from that because everyone becomes very unpredictable, and if that's in the climax of the story, especially Cthulhu one shots, perfect thing.
One more thing that I think is important, and that's the use of hallucinations in different tense, in different times. So if you, for example, if you use hallucination for past time, right, you can add to maybe a backstory of maybe you can add to something that is coming from unconscious, but it is a long forgotten thing, for example, like the character had some memory and maybe you are just recovering it because you think that could be a very nice impulse for the rest of the narrative, for the story. So if we use hallucinations to work on the pastime, that could bring another function, like remembering thing that we forgot, or like bringing something back from the conscious, like from a mental underworld, I would call it.
That's a very interesting thing. Of course, yes, that certainly goes under conveying information, and yes, you can hint back to the player that you've been through their backstory and add that backstory to their present situation. And then we can ask a question: what if you decide to give a hallucination to one player that is tied to the backstory of another player? Imagine that discussion. Yeah, even one might brush it off as I had this strange thing appear, like it must be just I'm tired or something. And the other player is like, did the DM just hint about my secret? I was the one who assassinated the king, and like they see a bloodied crown in your arms as a hallucination. You know, those things can really stir things up. Cool stuff for sure.
So my next question would be like, what would happen if we do it the other way? Like if hallucinations are focusing on the future, on things yet to come, then they bring some kind of prophetic value, prophecy, yeah, like a prophetic
Yeah,
function. Yeah.
they're like an omen, I think, in that case. And I usually don't do prophecies because then I do very vague prophecies. I don't do prophecies that are something I can't get out of if things are derailed. I tried it a couple of times, didn't work as I intended, and it's just, I would say, a matter of taste. I don't like them that much. It's very satisfying when you pull them off, for sure. Very satisfying for the players and for the GM. But sometimes it's easier to fake it and then like to go back and see something from your games and then tie to that than to think in advance. Anything where you think in advance in these games is quite unstable. Now, you said backstory, and it got me thinking. You know how when you remember things, you don't really, I don't know if this is true for everyone, but for me especially, I don't always remember the full like scene happening. When I remember anything from my life, I remember snapshots, like very short bursts of like a picture or association. Sometimes they string together. I think those kinds of hallucinations that you don't have enough time to interact with are in their own category, like instant hallucinations. Those that are just you blink, you see it, you blink, it's gone. And we said a lot of those are used in horror movies and in like other pop culture. But yeah, I think there is something there, and I think it is tied to the fact that we can only remember highlights, snapshots of a moment.
Okay, that kind of brings us to another question you already kind of mentioned, and that's the duration of the hallucination. So, how duration of hallucination can affect our perception, like if that's just like a glimpse of hallucination, like we just barely in just like 1 millisecond see something that is really really weird. Like I can see those hallucinations that are really short, they can be very intense, like they can really reshape our reality in some cruel scary way. But if they are short, we are okay with it, like we just saw it, like the moments from mainstream horror movies that
Bloody
we
Mary
all
in the mirror type
yeah,
of thing.
pretty much. So my question is like how that affects the like my perspective would be I think that like longer hallucinations, they bring like more meaning. I think because if they're longer, they definitely bring a lot of more information that you can extract from them. And then the short ones, if they are repeated in some shorter period of time, then you definitely perceive them as a bigger hallucination. And then are we saying that we are giving him a partial hallucination then, and how that affects him, because then he will have another task in front of him to like interpret.
If you need interpretation, because some, as we said, are tied to just like here's a jump scare. So I don't think all of them have some meaning inherently, but we can say that duration and intensity are two variables that two
We can
knobs that you
play
turn and
around
you play
with, yeah.
around with them. So we said short and instant, very instant and intense ones would be jump scares, but we then said, okay, we can have a very intense and a longer, not very long, but longer. We're talking 15 minutes, for example, hallucination. The example we gave where you're running down the street and everybody is looking at you. Then you can have a very long, very, very long, and we're not promoting use of any substances or any ways to induce hallucinations. We're just talking about widely available information on the internet.
Because why would you need those substances when
When
you
you
can
have
play
D&D,
TTRPGs?
absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you have substances that give you changed perception and hallucination for like 9 hours. And in the game, I would say, let's imagine something like that, but with very low intensity. Well, that might be where whenever you see a chair, you see a pink frog on it. And those pink frogs are following you around. Every chair you see, another pink frog joins your chaos of pink frogs and they're jumping everywhere. It's just a funny thing that reminds every time you mention it to players that you maybe as a player did something stupid. Like we had uh, one player eat a taxidermied bird from a castle. So that would be a fun way to kind of punish him and reward him at the same time, because something strange is happening and people are looking at you strange because you're paying attention to all your frogs, like you're growing attached to them. One fell into like a bucket, you're watching if it's okay, maybe saving it. Crazy things can manifest. So I think those two knobs are definitely things that you play around with: intensity and duration.
Intensity, duration, and the tense, right? Like if it's happening in
Time,
the
yeah.
time, yeah. There's definitely one perspective of time that we are kind of avoiding or skipping, but it's the problematic one, and that's the one that we are trying to live in. So the question is what we do about hallucinations that are happening in this moment. Like if a
Like the
player,
frogs.
I mean, yes, but like what about hallucinations, for example, during the combat? Like if a player starts hallucinating, and I don't care what the source is, it can be another, spell that makes him hallucinate, see things differently. He also has the metagaming knowledge, like the knowledge out of the game, like what's happening for real, and then he has this knowledge inside of hallucination. So it's becoming very problematic for him, like how he's going to react. Like is he going to react, so his actions are matching the perception of hallucination, or he's reacting with some information of the real world, let's call it that way, because he wants to reach that goal of his. For me personally, like these type of hallucinations, especially the long ones, would be very interesting in a game. I haven't experienced that yet, and I would really like to. That like I can like just accept that new reality and just act the appropriate way.
Well, you know how an average game of Call of Cthulhu looks at the end when everyone loses sanity. Those debuffs can be done like that, where you have one certain thing that is your debuff. Your hands don't work. You are paranoid and attacking the closest person next to you. Even there is a spell in Pathfinder called Confuse that has a small table that is similar to what you would see in the Bout of Madness table in Call of Cthulhu. And yeah, you're expected to play around with these, but in Pathfinder, where you have a lot of numbers and combat becomes very much tactical, it's a very small table and the duration is very short. And in Call of Cthulhu, you can end up being in the whole encounter and even afterwards still with this debuff. And it is expected of you as a player to, coming into this game, be aware that you're going to need to roleplay this. On the other hand, if I feel the group, if I'm with another group that is not like ours, not tied to the narrative as much, I would maybe abstract that. I would say you're hallucinating during the whole battle. This is your debuff on your, let's say, whatever, your perception. And then maybe I would add some narrative flavor every time we close a round. I would add a small description of what is changed in their perception, and I would make it something in the distance or something that's not affecting the battlefield as much because I'm already giving a debuff that is numerical. And then if they start acting, seeing those distortions, they start acting upon it, well, that's a sign for me that I can ramp it up. I can bring that physically closer to them. So I think, again, as a DM, it's all about feeling the room and seeing in what way you can enrich the experience. If it doesn't add to the experience, you're not gonna use it. It's the most fundamental rule of picking which mechanics you're gonna introduce in a game, which narrative concepts you're gonna use. Must be satisfying.
I would say that like all hallucinations that you use, they are very much affected by the context. For example, like if something is happening to a player that is already, of a unrealistic kind, let's call it, like something that he perceive as something very weird, something that would trigger his sanity check. Then hallucination of a kind, like let's say a character is turning into a cockroach, something already seen. So if he is doing this metamorphosis, like maybe some hallucination would actually help him during that process, like we all usually think of hallucinations as something that's extraordinary in the ordinary world.
To stop you right there. How is you're trying to explain to me that a hallucination can help your metamorphosis process from a man to a cockroach?
I'm just saying, if you're a cockroach,
How?
you might,
Wait,
you
how?
must. If you're a cockroach, you must see things differently, from a human being.
Okay,
And then
okay.
if you're
So visual distortion of your like field of view.
not just visual, you probably smell things differently. You also probably hear things differently. So I'm saying that something that would be considered as hallucination in human form doesn't have to be a hallucination in cockroach
bug.
form.
Right,
Exactly.
right.
So I'm saying that like that thing could be maybe preparation for your next form or stuff like that. I'm just using this example, don't get too attached to it. I'm just using this example to say, like, if something extraordinary is happening to a player, then a hallucination could have a different function opposite to the cases where everything is as ordinary, and then you have a hallucination that suggests something extraordinary is going to happen.
You know, I have an example of a person sitting on a couch on a party and looking into the beer can and having a vision of becoming a fly, I think, or a bee, something like that. But go watch that video. Here's an example of that there. You mentioned that your visuals or your senses are changing and you're still like in this form, it feels right. It's your natural perception of the world. So we mentioned a lot of different examples. We never classified what distortions exist. And I think we don't need to. If you want to have a classification of distortions of reality, I think my videos, and I'm not just shamelessly plugging my channel on my own channel, but in both visions and dreams videos, there is really, really a detailed breakdown of all the distortions that can happen. And if you're interested in seeing how hallucinations look in real life, there is actually a very interesting channel. Josie Kins is the name. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And they did this huge collab online to represent hallucinations induced by different kinds of substances or conditions into a database that is of subjective like perception. So basically they are trying to classify and show what it really looks like for some people, and they call it the subjective experience index. I'm going to link to it in the description. It's very interesting stuff. It's not wild like we imagine it in our games, but it might give you some idea of what happens when people are hallucinating, be it from substances or conditions.
I would like to say that we finally, this third episode, did something that we wanted. You don't have to play with all of these thoughts, and you also probably have a lot of your own thoughts regarding this matter. So I would say, like, if we brought some new scales that you can use, like, they're there, you can just, push it one or the other way, then we kind of did our goal in discussing this topic.
Definitely, definitely. I like to listen to podcasts that midway through I stop listening and start thinking. That's what RPG Mainframe did to me so many times, and I think that is what we want to do. We didn't like sit down and write this. We had some notes, but it's very hard to follow notes in a podcast format. So thank you very much for watching. If you want to continue this discussion, we have a Discord server. It's in the description of every video. Small but growing community of people that are interested in like deep thinking about art and about TTRPGs and about human psyche and psychology. So if that sounds interesting, just join us. There is no paywall or anything, but we do have a Patreon for those who want to support what we are doing. And I think we can now at least promise a release schedule. Like, I think we can do this. We will do it probably bi-weekly for Patreon and once a month for YouTube. But you can expect a couple of more episodes to be on YouTube right away in the following days. So, yes, I don't have anything else to say. Do you want to maybe plug something? Shout out a cool thing you saw?
If you ever miss hallucinating, you can always start the game. And if you ever have hallucination, you can say, it was just a game.
It was just a game. And with that, we're gonna wrap it up. Bye bye, everyone.
Bye.
Farewell, keepers.